China, Russia, and Iran just carried out joint military drills off the coast of South Africa.
Chinese, Russian, and Iranian warships arrive at South Africa's ports for a week of naval exercises.
These drills will start on Friday and run until the 16th of January.
And the location of these exercises may matter more than the drills themselves. So let me explain why this is a bigger deal than it might sound at first. 3 countries that are all feuding with the United States just brought warships thousands of miles from home to conduct exercises together in South African waters. And they did it at a place where the Indian Ocean meets the Atlantic, right next to one of the most important shipping routes on the planet. The drills started on January 10, 2026, and they're running for a full week. China is leading the exercise, which they're calling Will for Peace 2026. South Africa is hosting at Simonstown Naval Base, their main naval facility just south of Cape Town. Russia and Iran both sent ships, and officially, this is all about maritime security, protecting shipping lanes, and improving cooperation among BRICS Plus nations. But let's be clear about what actually showed up. China deployed the guided missile destroyer Tangxian and the replenishment ship Taihu. Russia sent the corvette Stoichi from their Baltic fleet, along with the oiler Yelnya. Iran brought the forward base ship Makron and the patrol combatant Nagdi as part of their 103rd Flotilla. These ships traveled thousands of miles to get there. The Chinese vessels left from Qingdao back in October 2025. The Russian ships departed from the Baltic in October as well, sailing all the way down the west coast of Africa. Iran's ships made the journey from the Persian Gulf. That's not a casual commitment. That's a deliberate show of presence. And here's what they're doing once they're there. According to official statements, the drills include joint maritime safety operations, interoperability exercises, and maritime protection activities. China's defense ministry said the theme is joint actions to ensure the safety of shipping and maritime economic activities. South Africa's military described it as an exchange of best practices and improving joint operational capabilities. But if you read between the lines, what that actually means is these 4 countries are practicing how to work together far from their home waters. They're testing communications. They're coordinating movements. They're demonstrating that they can operate jointly in a region that matters strategically. Now, before we go any further, you need to understand where this is happening. Simonstown sits right at the southern tip of Africa, where the Atlantic and Indian Oceans meet. Just offshore is the Cape Sea Lane, one of the busiest shipping routes in the world. When the Suez Canal gets blocked or when access to the Red Sea is disrupted, ships reroute around the Cape. Oil tankers, container ships, bulk carriers, all of them pass through these waters. So when China, Russia, and Iran bring warships to this exact spot and conduct exercises for a week, they're not just training. They're sending a message about their ability to project power in a region that controls access between 2 oceans. And South Africa is right in the middle of this, which brings us to the really interesting part of the story. South Africa agreed to host this exercise under the BRICS Plus framework. BRICS originally stood for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. Recently, it expanded to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. The idea behind BRICS is to create a counterweight to Western economic dominance, to give developing nations more influence in global affairs. But here's the problem. Not all BRICS members are participating in these drills. Brazil isn't there. India isn't there. Saudi Arabia isn't there. The UAE was reportedly invited, but it's unclear if they actually sent ships. So calling this a BRICS Plus exercise is technically accurate, but it's really a much smaller group. It's China, Russia, Iran, and South Africa. 3 countries under heavy Western sanctions and 1 country trying to walk a very thin line between East and West. South Africa's Democratic Alliance Party, which is part of the ruling coalition government, came out strongly against the exercise. They said calling it BRICS cooperation is misleading and that the government is choosing closer military ties with rogue and sanctioned states. They specifically criticized hosting Russia, which is currently waging war in Ukraine, and Iran, which is heavily involved in regional conflicts and faces international sanctions. But South Africa's military pushed back. They said the exercise was planned long before current tensions and that it was originally scheduled for November 2025, but got postponed because it conflicted with the G20 summit in Johannesburg. They insist this is about maritime security and regional stability, not about picking sides in global power struggles. Here's the thing though. South Africa claims to be non-aligned. They say they're not taking sides between the West and countries like Russia and China. But hosting this exercise, especially with Iran involved for the first time, sends a very clear signal about where South Africa's priorities lie. You can't host Russian warships while Russia is under Western sanctions for invading Ukraine and claim you're neutral. You can't welcome Iranian naval vessels while Iran is supporting militant groups across the Middle East and cracking down on protesters at home and say you're just focused on maritime security. And the timing makes it even more loaded. This exercise is happening right as tensions between the United States and several BRICS countries are spiking. Trump just seized a Russian oil tanker, claiming it was part of a shadow fleet carrying sanctioned oil. Washington has threatened action against Iran over protest crackdowns. The US has already slapped 30% tariffs on South African imports and expelled their ambassador. Trump has openly called BRICS anti-American. So when China leads a naval exercise with Russia and Iran in South African waters just weeks into Trump's second term, that's not a coincidence, that's a statement. Now let's talk about what this exercise actually communicates to the rest of the world. Because military drills are always about more than just training. They're a form of diplomacy. They're a way of signaling intentions, demonstrating capabilities, and showing who your friends are. For China, this exercise is part of a much larger strategy. China has been expanding its naval presence across Africa and the Indian Ocean for years. They've built a military base in Djibouti. They've secured port access in multiple African countries. They've been sending naval task forces on anti-piracy missions that double as diplomatic and military engagement tours. This exercise lets China show that it can coordinate complex operations far from home with partners who share its vision of challenging Western dominance. For Russia, this is about breaking isolation. Western sanctions since the invasion of Ukraine have tried to cut Russia off economically and diplomatically. But Russia has been working hard to build relationships in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to offset that pressure. Sending ships to South Africa for joint exercises with China and Iran shows that Russia still has friends, still has reach, and isn't going to be boxed in by Western pressure. For Iran, this is a rare opportunity to project power far beyond its usual theater. Iran's navy mostly operates in the Persian Gulf, the Gulf of Oman, and occasionally the Red Sea. Sending ships all the way to South Africa demonstrates that Iran can sustain naval operations at distance and that it's part of a broader coalition opposing Western influence. And for South Africa, this is complicated. On one hand, hosting the exercise reinforces South Africa's position as a regional power and the leader of the African members of BRICS. On the other hand, it damages South Africa's relationships with the United States and Europe, which are still major trade partners. South Africa exports billions of dollars worth of goods to Western markets every year. Alienating those partners for symbolic military cooperation with Russia and Iran is a risky move. But South Africa isn't making this decision in a vacuum. They're looking at what China offers, massive infrastructure investments, loans and trade deals, and comparing it to what the West offers, lectures about human rights and threats of sanctions. From South Africa's perspective, the West has been talking down to them for decades, while China has been writing checks. So when China asks South Africa to host an exercise, South Africa says yes. Now, let's talk about what this means economically, because this isn't just about ships and sailors. It's about who controls the global trade system. The Cape Sea Lane is a critical choke point. About 15% of global maritime trade passes around the southern tip of Africa. When the Suez Canal is blocked, or when conflicts disrupt the Red Sea, that percentage goes way up. In recent years, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea have forced shipping companies to reroute around the Cape, adding days to voyages and billions in costs. So when China, Russia, and Iran conduct naval exercises right next to that route, they're making a point. They're saying we have a presence here, we can operate here, and if we wanted to, we could influence what happens here. Now, nobody is suggesting these countries are about to start blockading shipping lanes or attacking commercial vessels. That would be an act of war. But the demonstration of capability matters. It tells the world that these waters aren't just controlled by Western navies anymore. It shows that China, Russia, and Iran can project power into regions that used to be dominated by the US and Europe. And it's not just about military presence, it's about financial systems too. China has been pushing for years to reduce the world's dependence on the US dollar. They've been promoting the yuan as an alternative currency for trade. they've been building payment systems that bypass SWIFT, the Western-controlled banking network, and they've been convincing countries to settle trade in local currencies instead of dollars. BRICS as a bloc has been talking about creating an alternative currency or a payment system that doesn't rely on Western financial infrastructure. If that actually happens, and that's a big if, it would fundamentally change how global trade works. Countries could buy oil, sell minerals, and conduct business without ever touching dollars or euros. That would weaken Western economic leverage enormously. So these naval drills aren't happening in isolation. They're part of a broader shift where countries that feel marginalized or threatened by the West are building alternative systems. Military cooperation, economic partnerships, and financial infrastructure are all pieces of the same puzzle. Now, what does this all mean going forward? Because that's the question everyone wants answered. Here's one way to read it. This exercise is a signal that the world is splitting into competing blocs. On one side, you have the United States, Europe, and their traditional allies. On the other side, you have China, Russia, Iran, and a growing number of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America that are tired of Western dominance. This isn't a new Cold War exactly, because the economic relationships are too intertwined, but it's something close. And South Africa hosting this exercise is a sign that they're choosing a side, or at least leaning heavily toward one. Another way to interpret it is that South Africa is trying to play both sides. They're hosting this exercise to keep China and Russia happy, but they're also maintaining trade relationships with the West because they need those markets. It's a balancing act, and it's not clear how long they can keep it up. Eventually, they're going to be forced to choose, and when that happens, the decision is going to have massive economic and political consequences. A third possibility is that this exercise doesn't mean as much as people think it does. It's a week of drills. Ships show up, they do some coordinated sailing, they fire a few practice rounds, and then they leave. It's symbolic, sure, but it doesn't change the balance of power. The US Navy is still vastly more powerful than China's. Europe still has influence in Africa, and BRICS, for all its talk, hasn't actually accomplished much in terms of building alternative systems that work. But here's what I think is undeniable. The fact that China, Russia, and Iran can bring warships to South Africa and conduct exercises without serious pushback shows that the world has changed. 20 years ago, this wouldn't have happened. The US would have pressured South Africa to cancel it, and South Africa would have complied. Now, South Africa is willing to risk Western anger because they see more benefit in aligning with China than in staying in the West's good graces. And that shift, more than the drills themselves, is what matters, because if South Africa, one of the most developed and strategically important countries in Africa, is willing to host Russian and Iranian warships, what does that say about Western influence on the continent? If China can lead military exercises in waters that control access to two oceans, what does that say about who's setting the rules in the 21st century? The exercise itself will end in a few days. The ships will leave. Life will go back to normal in Cape Town, but the message has been sent. And the people it was meant for, policymakers in Washington, Brussels, and London, definitely received it. When military exercises happen at this scale and in this location, they are never just about training.